In October 2023, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reached back thousands of years to frame a modern war, calling on his citizens to remember what Amalek has done to you. Invoking the Amalekites transforms a military campaign into a divinely mandated holy war. In this framework, the enemy is no longer a political rival, but an eternal, irredeemable evil. Consider how we would evaluate a modern leader who claimed to receive direct telepathic commands from burning objects, commands that ordered the total extermination of specific ethnic groups, including their children and livestock. From a clinical perspective, these behaviors point toward a clear diagnosis: severe psychosis, religious delusions, and a psychopathic disregard for human life. This clinical profile belongs to Moses, the central prophet of the Abrahamic tradition. By shielding these actions behind the veil of the divine, we have allowed a violent psychological template to remain at the foundation of Western thought for millennia. Moses was a product of the New Kingdom Egyptian court, a highly centralized, autocratic system where the pharaoh ruled as a living god. This empire relied on a military culture that viewed the annihilation of foreign chaos as a sacred duty. In this environment, overwhelming force was the primary tool of statecraft. We see the impact of this upbringing in his first recorded act, the impulsive, lethal murder of an Egyptian taskmaster. After the killing, Moses checked his surroundings and buried the body in the sand, a pragmatic attempt to evade consequences that reveals a pre-existing capacity for calculated violence. Before any burning bush or divine calling, Moses had already internalized the logic of the Egyptian court, that violence is the only effective resolution for perceived injustice. Once in the wilderness, these violent tendencies merged with what modern medicine identifies as auditory and visual hallucinations, voices emanating from fire and clouds, commanding absolute obedience. Clinical grandiosity manifests as unwavering belief in a divine mission. Moses wielded authority to enforce laws under threat of the earth swallowing his detractors. This pathology peaked in the Midianite campaign, where he explicitly ordered the execution of every captive boy and non-virgin woman. Centuries later, the Abrahamic tradition produced a radical internal critique. Jesus of Nazareth arrived and explicitly rebuked the eye for an eye retributive justice of the Mosaic law. Jesus introduced a framework of non-retaliation and universal inclusivity, demanding love even for the outgroups Moses had ordered destroyed. However, for rising Western empires, the compassion of Jesus was a strategic liability. To justify the conquest of new lands, they required the exclusionary, psychopathic blueprint of Moses. When a leader's exclusionary delusions are adopted by an entire population, the individual pathology scales into mass psychosis. This ideological virus is passed down through the uncritical veneration of sacred texts. The narrative of a chosen people, claiming a promised land, became a functional justification for land seizure. It provided a theological permit for actions that would otherwise be recognized as criminal. Early American Puritans utilized this logic by casting Native Americans as the new Canaanites, enemies of God who occupied land that rightfully belonged to the saints. Oliver Cromwell used these same Old Testament precedents to justify his slaughter of the Irish, just as the Boers in South Africa framed their migration as a modern exodus into a land they were divinely entitled to rule. This reached a peak with American Manifest Destiny. By framing the expansion across the continent as a divine mission, the government provided a moral cover for the systematic removal of indigenous cultures. By convincing colonizers they were fulfilling God's will, the Mosaic narrative provided a psychological bypass for the human aversion to violence, allowing atrocities to be committed with a clear conscience. The Mosaic root continues to shape geopolitical conflicts today. It is an active mechanism used to mobilize populations toward aggression. When modern politicians invoke ancient holy wars, they are tapping into this deep-seated ideological inheritance to bypass rational ethics and human rights. Moving forward requires us to evaluate these foundational myths through the lens of modern medicine and universal law, rather than granting them automatic divine immunity. If we want a future defined by justice, we must recognize the psychological mechanisms that have allowed ancient violence to masquerade as sacred duty for far too long.